Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that touches on, well, almost everything. Geopolitics, economics, tech, even human rights. We're looking at the evolution and the global impact of Israel's defense and security industry.
Yeah, it's really quite something how Israel's unique history and experiences have kind of shaped this incredibly powerful industry. And its influence on security practices, well, it's global. We're going to explore that complex interplay.
Right. And for this deep dive, our sources are excerpts from a pretty comprehensive text. It gives a really nuanced look at how this sector grew, its reach across the world, and importantly, the critical discussions happening around it.
Exactly. So our mission for you today is to get beyond just the what and into the why. Why did Israel become such a major global security player? And what are the implications when you export solutions that are described as battle-tested? We'll explore how the sources suggest those lines between national security, economic growth, and the occupation have gotten, well, very blurry.
Okay, so to set the scene, let's start with a quote. This is from Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett back in September 2021. He said, Israelis don't wake up in the morning thinking about the conflict. How does that statement, which the source highlights, sort of reflect the bigger strategic shifts after the Cold War ended?
That's a really interesting place to start because, the Cold War wraps up in the 90s, but the source points out that it didn't fundamentally change Israel's external defense posture. Its support for certain regimes, sometimes even stepping in where American aid left off, that apparently continued. There's this defense journalist, Yossi Melman, who described Israel's culture of security, turning the establishment into like a state within a state, implying weapons dealers had a huge amount of sway.
A state within a state. Wow. And it gets even more interesting, doesn't it? Because even though they were close allies with the U.S., Israel actually started pushing for more military autonomy from Washington in the 90s. The source suggests this was really kicked off by feeling, well, abandoned during the 1991 Gulf War. Iraq fires off, about 42 Scud missiles?
Yeah, around that number.
And the U.S. didn't directly jump in to help.
Right. That feeling of being left alone was apparently a real turning point.
Yeah.
So how did they achieve that autonomy? Well, the government really embraced privatization, shedding a lot of its old socialist roots. Most defense companies doing exports were actually government-owned until the 2000s, but the high-tech sector, that got massive state support. And it built really close ties with American cyber and defense companies. Places like Kiryat Gat became these big high-tech hubs.
And what about U.S. aid? I mean, that's always been a huge factor.
It has, and Israel's still the biggest recipient. But the source notes a really significant financial shift. Back in 1981, U.S. aid was something like 10% of Israel's entire economy. By 2020, though, it was down to about 1%. Still a lot of money, nearly $4 billion a year, but a much smaller slice of the pie.
Okay, so less financial dependence.
Exactly, and that financial independence is key, according to the source. It argues that's why Israel now cares far less about even the mildest American pressure on things like the settlements in the West Bank, or actions in Gaza, or house demolitions in East Jerusalem. But crucially, while they might be less reliant financially, that U.S. diplomatic shield, that remains absolutely vital, protecting Israel from what the text calls a tsunami of global condemnation. So the dependency changes shape, you see.
Got it. So despite getting international criticism for its policies after the Six-Day War, especially around colonization, the 21st century actually sees Israel building more alliances with Arab, African, Latin American states. The source also points out Israel now makes most of its own missile defense tech. And polling suggests most of its Jewish citizens aren't really losing sleep over solving the conflict or fearing isolation. The source says it indicates the status quo suits them just fine. That internal view is definitely something to consider. Okay, so the end of the Cold War didn't mean less involvement with violent autocracies. Our sources suggest quite the opposite, actually. Let's dig into some of those specific and frankly pretty startling examples of arms sales and exporting expertise.
Yeah, the persistence of these ties is really striking when you look at it. Take the Israeli human rights lawyer, Itay Mack. He's been digging into Israel's possible role in the 1994 Rwandan genocide. The source presents evidence suggesting Israel kept sending weapons, grenades, guns, ammo, even after the genocide kicked off on April 6, 1994. I mean, we're talking 800,000 to 1 million Rwandans killed in just 100 days. Mack even filed a petition in 2020 for a criminal probe, had a video interview with the pilot who allegedly flew the weapons in.
What happened?
Dismissed by the court. National security grounds. The source also mentions France was involved too, arming the Rwandan army. So it's complex.
And this export of Israeli expertise, it just kept going. Those infamous Galil rifles, Israeli-made, apparently used in the Guatemalan genocide. The source says they turned up with Colombian drug lords in the late 80s, part of a murky deal, as the text puts it, involving Israeli mercenaries and the head of the Medellin cartel, Rodriguez Gacha. An American investigator at the time even questioned, how could the Israeli government not know more about this?
That's a huge question about oversight, isn't it? Especially when, decades later, you still see Colombian elites drawn to Israel. There's a WikiLeaks cable from 2009 that revealed this Israeli company, Global CST, founded by a former IDF Major General, Israel Ziv, was helping the Colombian military fight FARC. The U.S. Embassy cable was pretty damning, saying Global CST had basically no Latin American experience, and their proposals looked more like ways to sell Israeli gear than actually meet Colombia's needs.
So what was the upshot in Colombia?
Well, interestingly, Colombian President Santos actually praised Global CST in 2011. He said, and the source quotes this, "We've Colombians even been accused of being the Israelites of Latin America, which personally makes me feel really proud." He even talked about how the methods that proved deficient in Nablus and Hebron began speaking Spanish in some promotional videos. Quite a statement. And it gets broader. Ziv himself. He faced U.S. Treasury sanctions in 2018 for allegedly selling weapons to both sides in the South Sudanese civil war. Those sanctions were lifted in 2020, kind of without explanation. But a UN report back in 2015 had already confirmed Israeli weapons were fueling that conflict.
Okay, let's jump forward then. 9/11. The source describes this as an event that turbocharged Israel's defense sector. There's that famous or infamous quote from Netanyahu on American TV the night of the attacks.
Right, he said it was very good for U.S.-Israel relations. Then he quickly corrected himself. Well, not very good, but it will generate immediate sympathy. He later apparently doubled down, saying the attacks swung American public opinion in our favor.
So Israel really seized that moment.
Absolutely. By 2004, the source notes, Israel's economy bounced back, and its arms industry went all in on homeland security. Yeah. Billions were generated. The message was pretty blunt, according to the text. We've been fighting a war on terror since day one. We'll show you how it's done.
And this feeds into that whole startup nation narrative, right? That 2009 book by Senor and Singer. Their argument was that Israel's economic success came from things like mandatory military service, close government tech ties. Singer even called Israel a startup country of immigrants.
Yeah, but the source we're looking at offers a critique of that narrative. Mm-hmm. It argues that this story often kind of papered over the reality that the biggest profits were actually coming from defense companies. Companies whose main goal, according to this text, was to monetize the occupation and sell that experience in controlling another people to a global market.
Monetize the occupation. So what specific experience was being sold then?
Well, the source points directly to products marketed as effectively battle-tested on Palestinians. Use examples like Elbit, the defense electronics company working on the U.S.-Mexico border, or Israel Aerospace Industries, IAI, using drones to monitor refugees for European governments. That battle-tested label was key.
And that startup nation ideology needs constant feeding, it seems. The source mentions an IAI ad campaign in 2022 trying to recruit young Israelis into defense work as an ethical decision, which someone then satirized on Twitter.
Right, saying something like, instead of writing code to get people addicted to poker, come work for IAI and write code that will kill those same people.
Yeah.
Pretty dark humor, but it captures the tension.
Yeah.
And Netanyahu himself, back in 2017, talked about cybersecurity being a never-ending business because there's never a permanent solution. Yeah. Forbes apparently attributed the success of Israel's cyber sector to huge government backing and the military basically acting as a startup incubator, testing new cyber defenses at home before selling them globally.
So bringing it back to the money, the bottom line, what does this all add up to financially?
By 2020, Israel was spending about $22 billion on its military, and it was the 12th biggest military supplier in the world, with sales over $345 million. So, yeah, a major economic player in this field.
Okay, so we have this picture of economic success, this booming defense sector, but at the same time, global public opinion towards Israel, especially in the U.S., has really shifted since 9/11. It's fascinating how those external views seem to contrast so sharply with internal Israeli attitudes, according to the source.
That contrast is definitely a key takeaway from the text. I mean, you look at the U.S., and particularly liberal and Democratic voters, they're becoming much more skeptical of Israeli actions.
Yeah.
There was a 2021 survey from the Jewish Electorate Institute, it found, 34% of American Jews agree Israel's treatment of Palestinians is similar to racism in the U.S., 25% agree Israel is an apartheid state, and 22% Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians.
Those are significant numbers.
They are. And another survey in 2022 by the American Jewish Committee found nearly 44% of young Jewish Americans didn't feel very connected to Israel. Even Pew Research found younger Americans, under 30, viewed Israelis and Palestinians about equally favorably. So there's a definite shift happening, particularly generationally.
So, given this changing international image, does the source suggest it's actually impacting Israeli policies on the ground? Is there a shift there?
Well, this is where the contrast becomes really stark. The source states pretty clearly that this deteriorating image has had little impact on the desire by mainstream Israelis to continue the occupation. Actually, it argues, if anything, it's made Israeli Jews more belligerent and determined to maintain the status quo. Why? Because, as the text puts it, there's been virtually no political, military, or diplomatic price for doing so. And the whole post-9/11 war on terror climate, the source argues, just reinforced Israel's practice of helping other countries fight their own unwanted populations, because the U.S., the superpower, was doing the same thing.
That's a pretty bleak assessment. How widespread are these connections we're talking about, these global ties?
The source gives several examples. Sri Lanka's civil war, which ended in 2009. Israel's role there was apparently key, though largely unpublicized. Selling Kinfair fighter jets, training their special task force described as a brutal police unit. The source says Sri Lanka essentially borrowed the Israeli playbook, ignoring NGO calls to stop the violence, building Sinhalese settlements in Tamil areas, a tactic directly compared to Israel's presence in the West Bank. And apparently a $50 million deal for jet upgrades in 2021 shows those ties are ongoing.
And then there's Myanmar. The UN has credibly accused them of genocide against the Rohingya. What does the source say about Israel's involvement there?
It's chilling. The text details a secret 2015 visit by a Myanmar delegation to Israel. They toured defense industries, naval bases, air bases, negotiating deals for drones, phone hacking systems, rifles, warships. Myanmar's military chief, Min Aung Hlaing, the guy later named by the UN for human rights abuses, even visited Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial, and met Israeli leaders.
Visiting Yad Vashem while being accused of... Wow.
The contradictions are just glaring. In 2018, Israel actually signed an education pact with Myanmar to teach about the Holocaust. Public pressure forced them to scrap it. But even after an international arms embargo was in place, Myanmar officials were reportedly at Israel's biggest weapons conference in 2019. The Israeli ambassador there, Ronen Gulor, kept tweeting support for Myanmar's leaders, even after the 2021 coup. Those tweets were later deleted, the source notes.
In the secrecy around all this, Israel claimed it stopped selling equipment to Myanmar in 2018.
Yeah, but the source questions how truthful that was, given the extreme secrecy. It mentions newly declassified documents suggesting Israel saw Myanmar as a unique business opportunity right from its independence in 1948, selling copious amounts of deadly weapons for friendly votes in international bodies, and even ramping up sales during the worst of the country's atrocities.
So when did Israel actually condemn the atrocities against the Rohingya?
Only in 2019, according to the source. And Itay Mack, the lawyer, suggested this might have been because Ambassador Giller's supportive tweet could have been seen as evidence of criminal intent against Israeli officials. The source also draws a parallel, Israel refusing to let Rohingya refugees return, linked to its own refusal regarding Palestinian refugees from 1948.
And this pattern of supporting controversial regimes, it seems to cut across the political spectrum in Israel.
Apparently so. The source cites Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and his Defense Minister Benny Gantz, considered more centrist, visiting Singapore, which is effectively a one-party state, for arms sales meetings. This is despite Gantz having previously said Israel shouldn't sell arms to regimes that commit genocide. Singapore, the text notes, is hardly a model democracy.
And there was another example. Equatorial Guinea.
Right. The vice president, Teodoro Nguema Obiang Mange, his father, is the world's longest-serving dictator. He visited Israel in 2021, bought suicide drones from Israeli contractors, and again was given a tour of Yad Vashem. So the pattern seems pretty consistent based on these accounts.
Okay, so this whole ability to, as the source puts it, monetize the occupation really got turbocharged after 9/11. The message being sold wasn't just about fighting terror, was it? It was bigger. Sociologist David Lyon called it a wholesale reimagining of what societies would look like in the 21st century. Surveillance becoming just normal. a feature of everyday life.
Exactly. Israel really leaned into that. It positioned itself as the go-to expert for urban security, crowd control, command centers. They even secured big events like the 2004 Athens Olympics and the 2008 Beijing Games. The source also raises questions here about how terrorism got defined in the mainstream media post 9/11, often featuring pro-Israel voices pushing harsh methods, kind of lumping different groups together, while critical voices or Arab and Muslim perspectives were often sidelined due to pressure, the source claims, from the powerful Israel lobby.
So this battle-tested experience, how did that play into Israel's appeal, particularly from an economic or political perspective?
Well, academic Neve Gordon, who's on record calling Israel an apartheid state, has an interesting argument reported in the source. He says Israel's counterterrorism experience is attractive not just because they kill terrorists, but because doing so isn't necessarily bad for neoliberal economic goals. Free markets privatization, it actually advances them.
Advances neoliberal goals. How does that connect to democracy, though? Seems contradictory.
Gordon's argument, as presented in the text, is that the appeal comes from this idea, real or perceived, that fighting terror using these homeland security methods, which might include suspending due process, torture, random searches, that this somehow doesn't conflict with democratic values. The ultimate hook, he argues, is Israel's ability to package together a militaristic worldview with a neoliberal economic agenda and a democratic political regime. It's a potent mix.
Right. And then the source takes this really unexpected, provocative turn. Quote, "If the fear of terrorism does not sell Israeli militarism, then sexual allure will." It introduces this group called the Alpha Gun Girls, or AGA, founded in 2018 by a former IDF veteran, Oren Julie. It features scantily dressed women posing with Israeli military gear, promoting what the source calls a strongly Zionist agenda. At a 2019 Defense Expo, ISDEF, they were apparently handling rifles, handing out brochures with their Instagram details and measurements.
Yeah, it's quite something. The source suggests this sexualizing Israeli weaponry was a brazen way to counter growing online criticism of Israeli occupation policies. It connects the Jewish state with pro-Israel gun culture supporters in America. Sophia Goodfriend, a scholar who researches Israeli surveillance, is quoted saying AGA exports Israel's ability to deny violence and normalize occupation by aestheticizing warfare, basically making the occupation seem apolitical by ignoring the people suffering from it.
So the source seems to argue that it was almost inevitable for the occupation itself to become increasingly privatized. You have Israeli companies involved in maintaining the infrastructure of the occupation, finding, quote, innovative ways to sell their services to the state, test the latest technology on Palestinians, and then promote them around the world. Even though these defense industries are more private now, they still act like an extension of Israel's foreign policy.
And the source is quick to point out the human cost of this broader neoliberal shift within Israel itself. It says it's been devastating. Israel apparently has the highest income inequality in the OECD. Poverty rates in 2020 were stark, 23% for Israeli Jews, but 36% for the Arab population.
In this outsourcing of the occupation, it even involves the Palestinian Authority, the PA.
Yes. The source describes the Western-backed PA as a reliable enforcer of the status quo. It cites the 2008-2009 Gaza War, during which the PA apparently brutally suppressed Palestinian protests. The text makes a point that for Palestinians on the ground, it often doesn't matter if the occupation is privatized or not because, quote, it makes no difference if a state officer or private individual harasses or humiliates them. Accountability seems absent either way.
And the technologies involved, checkpoints.
Right. Checkpoints using facial recognition, biometric data. The source says it dehumanizes the whole process. Often there's no real interaction at all, just a booming voice over a speaker. It mentions a specific incident in 2016. Private security guards killed a woman, Maram Salih Abu Ismail, and her brother at Kalandia checkpoint. And according to the text, nobody was ever held accountable. It suggests that outsourcing security can lead to the shoot-to-kill policy becoming even more widely applied.
The scale is huge. The UN counted 593 checkpoints and roadblocks in the West Bank. And over half the main checkpoints between Israel and the West Bank Gaza have been privatized since 2005, often staffed by Army veterans.
Yeah, staffed by veterans working for private companies like G1 Secure Solutions or Modi and Ezrachi. These companies also operate inside West Bank settlements, which the source says effectively erases any distinction between Israel proper and the occupied territories.
So why isn't this privatization discussed more openly in Israel?
Well, according to the source, policymakers tend to frame it differently. They talk about civilianizing the checkpoints or creating autonomy for Palestinians. This, the text argues, perpetuates an illusion that the occupation is just temporary. Scherhever, an economic researcher cited, suggests it'll only become a political issue for Israeli elites if keeping these private contracts going becomes too expensive, revealing the core function is really just occupation and repression of Palestinians.
Hever also makes an interesting point about authoritarian regimes learning from Israel.
Yeah, he notes that while they still want to learn how Israel manages Palestinians, the more they learn, the more they realize that Israel does not actually control the Palestinians very effectively. Despite that, support for Israel by right-wing groups and politicians around the world is still going strong.
And the wider business world sees opportunity here. KPMG.
Right. A 2021 KPMG report highlighted in the source actually encouraged an investment in the defense sector. It said global instability, made worse by COVID-19, was basically good for the defense business. It even talked about remote killing and drones implying a sort of cleaner and less bloody remote form of warfare. The implication being arms makers are moving away from the messy and ugly weapons of the past.
Which leads us back to surveillance. Israel's industry there is largely unregulated but leading the world.
That's what the source argues. It mentions the 2022 Israeli Defense Exposition in Tel Aviv, 12,000 people, 90 countries, including states with poor human rights records like Bahrain, Belarus, Myanmar. AI-driven surveillance tools were everywhere, marketed as increasing convenience, but the source claims their true aim was to improve their ability to monitor and target unwanted populations.
The money involved globally is just staggering. That 2022 U.S. defense budget was $768 billion, the biggest ever.
Yeah, and the source throws in a Transparency International stat from a 90s CIA report estimating the weapons industry accounted for like 45% of all corruption in world trade back then. It gives some context to the scale.
Let's talk about specific companies mentioned. AnyVision, now called Usto.
Right. The source says they secretly monitor Palestinians across the West Bank using AI, biometrics, facial recognition. They claim their products are ethical. Their CEO apparently initially denied the occupation existed when NBC asked, then had to apologize. The text argues they use the occupation itself to train their mass surveillance systems, supposedly to stop Palestinian attackers.
And their reach is global.
Very much so. Operating in over 40 countries, the source says, including Russia and China. Used in casinos, factories, even fitness centers. Microsoft invested $74 million back in 2019, but pulled out in 2020 after pressure. And interestingly, former Biden press secretary Jen Psaki even briefly worked for AnyVision as a crisis communications consultant.
Okay, another one. Coresight AI. Partly Israeli owned.
Yes, working with police in Mexico and Brazil described as brutal. And the source highlights a partnership with a former Israeli army colonel, Danny Tirza. He designed parts of the separation wall, lives in an illegal settlement himself. He worked with Coresight AI on a police body camera that could identify people in crowds, even if their faces are covered. His rationale, according to the source, it reduces friction between the IDF and Palestinians at checkpoints.
And the IDF itself is using similar tech, Blue Wolf.
Yeah, the Blue Wolf app, used since 2019. It captures Palestinian faces, runs them against this huge database nicknamed Facebook for Palestinians. Soldiers were apparently even competing to take the most photos. The source says this is most extreme in Hebron, where Palestinians are heavily monitored, sometimes even inside their homes, while extreme Jewish settlers face less scrutiny.
So what does this surveillance mean for daily life?
Well, in Hebron, in 2022, Israel installed this remote-controlled system. It can fire tear gas, sponge-tipped bullets, stun grenades. The Blue Wolf app itself was reportedly a smaller part of a bigger database called Wolfpack, containing details on almost every Palestinian in the West Bank. Soldiers were required to log details and photos of at least 50 Palestinians per shift, often with, quote, no security rationale for doing so, according to the source, based on whistleblower accounts.
But does all this tech actually work as well as claimed? Itay Mack, the lawyer, is skeptical.
He is. Mack believes these firms really exaggerate the impact of their products. He argues, and the source reports this, that Israel's internal security service, the Shin Bet, still relies massively on old-fashioned human intelligence informants, basically. Friends, family, and community members, not just fancy private tech. Journalist Gideon Levy is also quoted describing the Shin Bet's work as sustaining the occupation by means of tyrannical control, violating rights, constantly snooping.
So amidst all this, these pervasive exports, the surveillance state, voices of dissent become really crucial. Let's circle back to Itay Mack, the human rights lawyer. The source calls him a public gadfly, a rare voice in Israel speaking out against these relationships with despots.
Yeah, and it's a real uphill battle for him. The source details his unsuccessful fight in 2020 to get Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial, to stop inviting alleged war criminals and human rights abusers. The High Court rejected his petition. Their reasoning: such visits could have educational value. Mack pointed out that a big Auschwitz liberation event at Yad Vashem in 2020 had 0 participants from Africa, East Asia, or Latin America only, in his words, whites with Judeo-Christian identities.
In Yad Vashem's own response to the petition about accountability.
It was pretty extraordinary, as the source puts it. They basically said they were not known of reports about guests being involved in serious international crimes and couldn't corroborate or refute them. Mack himself says his goal isn't about fixing Israel or its image. It's about preventing genocide, crimes against humanity, and gross violations of human rights. End quote. Because he argues Israel's complicit globally. He wants to expose what he sees as hypocrisy. Israel playing the anti-Semitic card while simultaneously, quote, whitewashing fascist and anti-Semitic regimes as long as they accept Israel's policies towards Palestinians. He says he's seen this pattern in the archives going back to 1948.
What's really interesting, though, is the kind of support he gets. It's unexpected.
It is. He's a white Jewish man, acknowledges his privileged position, but he gets support from across the Israeli political spectrum, from the far right to the far left. The source mentions Eli Yosef, a right-wing settler who calls arms sales to dictators spiritual suicide, and Rabbi Avedon Friedman, another settler, who talks about the moral corruption that rebounds on us. So it's not a simple left-right issue for everyone there.
But the legal avenue seems to be closing. The Supreme Court decision in 2021.
Right. The court decided it wouldn't hear challenges to defense exports anymore except in very extreme circumstances, essentially giving the government free rein. So Mack's strategy had to change. He now wants to work as a lawyer, but outside the Israeli courts, focusing on legal and public campaigns instead. He's quoted saying, "One cannot say that Israel is an apartheid state and still go to the courts. It's a significant shift in tactics."
So wrapping this up, this deep dive has really laid bare a complex and often, let's face it, uncomfortable truth. Israel's defense and surveillance sector isn't just an economic powerhouse. It's deeply woven into its geopolitical strategy and the everyday reality of the occupation. It seems to thrive by exporting these battle-tested solutions born out of its own unique security situation.
Absolutely. And what's really emerged from exploring the sources is how these systems, often presented as being about security or even convenience, end up primarily serving to monitor and control populations deemed unwanted. It blurs so many ethical lines and raises fundamental questions about human rights, about accountability, not just in Israel, but globally.
So for you, the listener, taking all this information forward, what are the key takeaways?
Well, I think it leaves us with a really profound question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
As technology keeps advancing, as global instability seems to be driving more and more investment into defense and surveillance, what are the long-term consequences for nations like Israel that pioneer and export these methods, and for the global community that imports them? What happens when the actual experience of controlling people, of occupation, becomes a highly profitable, widely traded commodity? How does that fundamentally reshape what we even mean by security?